August 7th, 1943. Rechlin Luftwaffe Test Center, Brandenburg, Germany. Oberst Werner Baumbach stood motionless on the rain-slicked tarmac, studying the aircraft before him with a mixture of professional curiosity and growing unease. The four-engine bomber sat like a metallic fortress, its aluminum skin gleaming dully under the overcast sky. 70 feet long, 110 feet from wingtip to wingtip, tail number 42-52886. This was not wreckage salvaged from a combat crash. This was a nearly intact consolidated B-24 Liberator, forced down over occupied Norway 3 weeks earlier, now delivered to Germany's premier aviation test facility for comprehensive evaluation. But what had captured Baumbach's attention, what would fundamentally alter Luftwaffe fighter tactics for the remainder of the war, was what he discovered when his technical team completed their first walkthrough inspection. 10 defensive gun positions. 10 separate fields of fire. 10 overlapping zones of protection that created what fighter pilots would come to call kill boxes, areas of airspace so saturated with defensive fire that attacking them meant near certain death. Baumbach, commander of Kampfgeschwader 30 and one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced bomber pilots, had spent 2 years attacking Allied shipping across the North Atlantic and Arctic seas. He understood defensive armament. He knew how turrets functioned, how gunners operated, how fields of fire intersected. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what American engineers had created in the B-24. This was not simply a bomber with defensive guns. This was a flying weapons platform where the guns were as important as the bombs, where defensive firepower had been elevated to a design principle equal to speed, range, and payload capacity. The mathematics of this discovery would reshape German fighter tactics and force a complete reassessment of daylight bombing, vulnerability. Every assumption Luftwaffe planners held about acceptable bomber defensive capabilities, about the price American engineers were willing to pay in weight and complexity, about the effectiveness of coordinated defensive fire, was about to be systematically demolished by the evidence contained within this single captured example of America's most heavily produced bomber. The journey to this revelation had begun nearly 2 years earlier, on June 12, 1942. That morning, 13 B-24 Liberators from the Halpro project, commanded by Colonel Harry Halverson, departed Fayid, Egypt, on a mission that would mark the type's combat debut in the European theatre. Their target was the Ploesti oil fields in Romania, nearly 1,000 miles distant, the primary source of petroleum for the German war machine. The mission achieved tactical surprise. Arriving over the target at dawn, the formation dropped its bombs from high altitude, damaging refinery facilities and demonstrating the B-24's exceptional range capability. No German fighters intercepted the formation during the attack itself. The distance from known Allied bases had made such a raid seem impossible to Axis planners. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But the Liberator's true defensive capabilities would not be tested until American heavy bombers began flying in strength over occupied Europe. On August 17, 1942, 12 B-17 Flying Fortresses struck the Sotteville-les-Rouen marshalling yards in France, in what became the first American heavy bomber mission over Western Europe. The B-24 would join these operations within weeks. On October 9, 1942, B-24 Liberators participated in their first mission over occupied France, striking the steelworks at Lille alongside B-17 formations. German fighter pilots, veterans of 3 years of aerial combat across Europe and the Eastern Front, approached these American bombers with confidence born from experience. They had destroyed Soviet bombers by the hundreds over Russia. They had shattered British bomber formations during the Battle of Britain. They had developed tactics specifically designed to defeat heavy bomber formations through coordinated attacks that overwhelmed defensive gunners. The Americans, they believed, would prove no more difficult than previous opponents. The first engagements produced results that reinforced German confidence. American formations were small, numbering dozens of bombers rather than hundreds. Fighter escorts lacked the range to accompany bombers deep into occupied territory. Luftwaffe fighters could attack with relative impunity once American fighters turned back due to fuel limitations. German pilots reported the American bombers were heavily armed, but coordinated attacks from multiple angles could saturate defensive capabilities and allow fighters to close to lethal range. Major Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II developed what would become the standard German tactic for attacking American heavy bomber formations: the head-on attack. Rather than approaching from behind, where tail gunners could engage at maximum range, fighters would approach from 12 o'clock high, diving toward the bomber nose at closure rates exceeding 500 miles per hour. At those speeds, the engagement window lasted only seconds. American nose gunners had minimal time to track and fire. The fighters' forward-firing armament would be concentrated on the bomber's cockpit and forward fuselage, killing pilots and destroying flight controls. The tactic was devastatingly effective. On January 27, 1943, B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses struck Wilhelmshaven in Germany's first daylight raid on a German target since the war began. Luftwaffe fighters employed Meyer's head-on attack tactics, with significant success. 3 American bombers were shot down, multiple others returned to base with severe damage. German pilots reported that while the American defensive fire was heavy, coordinated attacks could overwhelm gunner capabilities. But these early engagements involved relatively small American formations, typically fewer than 100 bombers total. The Luftwaffe had not yet faced massed formations numbering hundreds of aircraft where defensive fire from multiple bombers could create overlapping protection zones. That reality would change dramatically throughout 1943 as American bomber strength increased and tactical doctrine evolved. The B-24 Liberator, that would provide the most detailed intelligence to German analysts, was shot down on July 15, 1943, during a raid on marshalling yards in Norway. The aircraft, serial number 42-52886, had departed from England carrying a full bomb load and maximum fuel. It was part of a small formation striking targets that supported German operations in the Arctic. Approximately 40 miles from the target, the formation encountered heavy flak. Shell fragments damaged 2 of the Liberator's 4 engines. The pilot, Lieutenant James Morrison, attempted to maintain formation, but with 2 engines producing no power and a 3rd engine running roughly, maintaining altitude became impossible. Morrison ordered the crew to jettison bombs and prepare for emergency landing. The Liberator descended gradually, losing altitude at approximately 500 feet per minute. Morrison searched desperately for suitable landing terrain in the mountainous Norwegian landscape. He spotted a frozen lake in a remote valley, its surface appearing solid enough to support the bomber's weight. The approach was textbook perfect despite the crippled aircraft. Morrison brought the Liberator down at minimum controllable airspeed, touching down on the ice with landing gear, retracted to distribute weight across the fuselage. The aircraft slid nearly 800 yards before coming to rest, essentially intact. The crew evacuated immediately, expecting the ice to give way beneath nearly 30 tons of aircraft. But the lake's surface held. The B-24 sat on the frozen surface, damaged but structurally complete. Norwegian resistance fighters reached the crash site within hours. They photographed the aircraft and attempted to salvage useful equipment before German forces arrived. But the remote location and difficult terrain meant that complete destruction of the bomber was impossible before German recovery teams could respond. 3 days later, German troops secured the site. They established a perimeter and began the complex process of recovering the aircraft. The lake's frozen surface would remain solid for only a few more weeks. Recovery had to be completed before spring thaw made the site inaccessible. German engineers constructed a reinforced sled beneath the bomber's fuselage. Using draft horses and eventually a tracked recovery vehicle, they dragged the Liberator across the ice to shore, then overland to the nearest road capable of supporting heavy transport. The bomber was disassembled into major components, wings separated from fuselage, tail section removed, engines detached. Each component was loaded onto specialized transport vehicles for the journey to Rechlin. The recovery operation took 3 weeks and involved more than 200 personnel. The effort reflected the Luftwaffe's recognition that an intact American heavy bomber represented an intelligence opportunity of extraordinary value. By early August, the Liberator had been reassembled at Rechlin, Germany's equivalent to the American Wright Field Test Facility. The aircraft was placed under armed guard in a secure hangar. Oberst Werner Baumbach was assigned to lead the technical evaluation. Baumbach assembled a team that included experienced fighter pilots, bomber crews, armament specialists, and aeronautical engineers. Their mandate was comprehensive: evaluate the aircraft's performance characteristics, assess its defensive capabilities, identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited in combat, and recommend tactical changes to improve Luftwaffe effectiveness against American heavy bomber formations. The team began with a systematic external inspection. The B-24's physical dimensions were impressive by any standard. Fuselage length of 67 feet, 3 inches. Wingspan of 110 feet. Height of 18 feet, standing on its tricycle landing gear. Empty weight of 37,100 pounds, approximately 16,800 kilograms. Maximum takeoff weight of 65,000 pounds, approximately 29,465 kilograms. The weight figures reflected an aircraft designed to carry substantial bomb loads over long distances while maintaining defensive armament that added significant mass. The 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, were mounted in nacelles along the wing's leading edge. German engineers noted with professional respect that American engine technology had achieved reliable power outputs that German manufacturers struggled to match. The turbochargers mounted on each engine enabled the Liberator to maintain performance at altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet, where thin air reduced naturally aspirated engine power significantly. But what captured the evaluation team's most intense attention was the defensive armament configuration. 10 gun positions distributed throughout the aircraft. Each position was examined in exhaustive detail, its field of fire mapped, its ammunition capacity documented, its effectiveness assessed. The nose turret, mounted in the forward fuselage just ahead of the cockpit, contained 2 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns. The turret could rotate through 180 degrees of azimuth and elevate from -50 degrees to +60 degrees. This provided coverage of the entire forward hemisphere, except for areas blocked by the aircraft's own structure. The top turret, located behind the cockpit atop the fuselage, also mounted 2 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns. This turret could rotate through 360 degrees of azimuth and elevate from -15 degrees to +90 degrees. The gun's field of fire covered virtually the entire upper hemisphere. Any fighter attacking from above came under fire from this position before entering effective range with its own weapons. The ball turret, suspended beneath the fuselage just aft of the bomb bay, represented one of the B-24's most distinctive features. This fully enclosed spherical turret rotated through 360 degrees of azimuth and could depress to -90 degrees, pointing straight down. 2 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns provided coverage of the entire lower hemisphere. German fighter pilots had learned to attack heavy bombers from below, where earlier bomber types had minimal defensive coverage. The ball turret eliminated that vulnerability entirely. The tail turret mounted 2 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns in the extreme aft fuselage. This position covered the 6 o'clock position, the traditional approach angle for fighter attacks. The guns could traverse through approximately 90 degrees of azimuth and elevate through similar range. Tail gunners had the clearest field of fire and the longest engagement time against pursuing fighters. The waist gun positions, 2 on each side of the aft fuselage, each mounted a single 50-caliber Browning M2 machine gun. These manually operated positions provided lateral coverage, protecting the bomber's sides from beam attacks. The fields of fire overlapped significantly, meaning fighters attacking from either side faced fire from multiple gun positions simultaneously. German armament specialists examined the Browning M2 machine guns with particular interest. The 50 caliber weapon, firing a 12.7mm round, represented one of the most effective aircraft guns in service. Muzzle velocity of approximately 2,900 feet per second gave the projectile substantial kinetic energy. Rate of fire of approximately 800 rounds per minute from each gun meant that turrets with 2 guns could deliver 1,600 rounds per minute into target areas. The ammunition was equally impressive. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate German fighter armor at ranges exceeding 500 yards. High-explosive incendiary rounds detonated on impact, causing devastating damage to aircraft structures. Tracer rounds enabled gunners to observe their fire and adjust aim. The mix of ammunition types meant that every burst contained rounds capable of destroying fighters through different mechanisms. Penetration, explosion, and fire. Baumbach personally interviewed captured American gunners held as prisoners of war. These interviews provided insights into training, tactics, and combat experience that complemented the technical evaluation. The Americans described gunnery training that lasted weeks, focusing on deflection shooting, range estimation, and coordination between gun positions. Gunners trained on skeet ranges to develop tracking skills. They practiced on turret simulators that replicated combat conditions. They studied aircraft recognition until they could identify German fighter types instantly at combat ranges. More significantly, the Americans described tactical coordination between gunners that German analysts had not fully appreciated. B-24 crews practiced defensive fire discipline extensively. Gunners learned to hold fire until fighters closed to effective range, typically inside 600 yards. Premature fire wasted ammunition and revealed the bomber's defensive posture without inflicting damage. But once a fighter crossed the effective range threshold, all gunners with clear shots would fire simultaneously. This coordinated fire created what American gunners called a beaten zone, an area of airspace so saturated with projectiles that fighters crossing it faced near-certain hits. A single 50 caliber machine gun fired approximately 13 rounds per second. A turret with 2 guns fired approximately 26 rounds per second. When multiple turrets engaged the same target, the combined fire rate created a wall of steel through which fighters had to fly. One captured American gunner, Sergeant Robert Henderson, explained the philosophy to his German interrogators. "We don't try to track individual fighters perfectly. We fill the space they're going to occupy with bullets." At closure rates of 500 miles per hour, fighters cross through defensive fire zones in 2 or 3 seconds. If we can put 200 rounds into that zone during those 3 seconds, probability says some of them will hit. And with 50 cal, you don't need many hits. The mathematics were brutal. A fighter approaching head-on at 400 miles per hour closure rate would cross from 600 yards to 200 yards, the effective engagement envelope, in approximately 2.04 seconds. During those 2 seconds, a B-24's nose turret would fire approximately 53 rounds from its 2 guns. If the top turret could also engage, another 53 rounds. 106 rounds total, filling a cone of space, perhaps 30 feet in diameter at the point where the fighter would pass the bomber. German pilots typically flew Messerschmitt Bf 109 or Focke-Wulf 4 190 fighters during these attacks. Both aircraft had critical components: engine, cockpit, fuel tanks, vulnerable to 50 caliber fire. A single solid hit to the engine could cause catastrophic failure. A round through the cockpit could kill the pilot instantly. Fire in the fuel system would consume the aircraft within seconds. The probability of evading 106 rounds in 2 seconds while maintaining attack heading was vanishingly small. But the B-24's defensive capability became even more formidable when flying in formation. American bombers did not fly alone. They flew in tight formations called combat boxes, typically 18 to 21 aircraft arranged in staggered altitude layers. The combat box formation meant that an attack on any single bomber brought the attacker under fire from multiple aircraft simultaneously. German test pilots flew captured fighters against the Rechlin B-24, while engineers mapped the fields of fire and calculated engagement geometries. These tests revealed the true lethality of American bomber formations. An attack from 12 o'clock high, the favoured German tactic, brought the fighter under fire from the target, bomber's nose turret and top turret. But it also exposed the fighter to fire from every bomber in the formation with a clear shot. In a tight 18-aircraft combat box, that could mean 6 to 8 bombers engaging simultaneously. The combined firepower was staggering. 8 bombers, each with 2 guns that could bear on the target, meant 1650 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously. At 800 rounds per minute per gun, that equaled 12,800 rounds per minute, 213 rounds per second filling the approach corridor. No fighter could survive that environment. Even if the pilot pressed the attack successfully and destroyed his target, the probability of his own aircraft being hit fatally was overwhelming. Hauptmann Hans-Joachim Jabs, an experienced night fighter pilot assigned to the evaluation team, flew simulated attacks against the captured B-24, while other pilots documented the engagement from ground cameras. After 3 simulated attacks, Jabs reported his findings bluntly. This is suicide. The defensive fire from a single bomber is manageable if you accept losses. The defensive fire from a formation is impossible. Every approach angle is covered. Every attack corridor is saturated with fire. We are sending our pilots into a meat grinder. The evaluation expanded to include vulnerability analysis. German engineers wanted to identify critical systems that, if destroyed, would disable the bomber. They examined the flight control system, the hydraulic systems, the fuel system, the electrical system, searching for single points of failure that fighter attacks could target. The B-24's design revealed careful attention to redundancy and damage tolerance. Flight controls used cables routed through different areas of the fuselage. Severing one cable might degrade control authority, but would not eliminate it completely. Hydraulic systems had backup accumulators that provided temporary power if main hydraulic pumps failed. Fuel was distributed across multiple tanks in different locations. Destruction of one tank still left substantial reserves. The 4-engine layout provided redundancy that single or twin-engine bombers lacked. The B-24 could maintain flight on 3 engines, albeit with reduced speed and altitude capability. It could even fly on 2 engines for limited periods, enough to escape combat areas and reach friendly territory. German fighters typically mounted weapons optimized for destroying lightly built aircraft. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G model's primary armament consisted of one 20mm MG-151 cannon firing through the propeller hub and 2 13mm MG-131 machine guns, above the engine. This armament proved devastating against fighters and light bombers, but against heavy bombers with multiple engines, redundant systems, and structural ruggedness, it often proved inadequate. Destroying a B-24 required either killing the pilot, causing catastrophic structural failure, or setting the aircraft on fire. The first option was difficult because the cockpit was heavily protected and represented a small target. The second option required concentrating fire on wing routes or control surfaces, but defensive fire made extended firing runs suicidal. The third option, fire, was most reliable but required hitting fuel tanks or engines with incendiary rounds, again difficult under defensive fire. The evaluation team also examined American defensive tactics in detail through combat film analysis and prisoner interrogation. They discovered that American crews practiced evasive maneuvers designed to complicate German attack geometries without breaking formation integrity. Pilots would make small altitude and heading changes, enough to throw off attacker aim, but not enough to disrupt formation defensive fire coordination. These subtle maneuvers forced German pilots to continuously adjust their own heading and attitude during attack runs, making accurate gunnery nearly impossible while under defensive fire. More significantly, American formations were supported by escort fighters whenever range permitted. The arrival of long-range P-47 Thunderbolt fighters, equipped with drop tanks in mid-1943, meant that German fighters faced increasing interference from American escort fighters even during attacks on bomber formations. By late 1943, P-51 Mustangs with even greater range began appearing as escorts. German fighters now faced a brutal choice: engage the escorts and leave the bombers unmolested, or attack the bombers while under attack themselves from American fighters. The Rechlin evaluation concluded in October 1943. Baumbach submitted his report to Luftwaffe High Command with recommendations that would reshape German fighter tactics for the remainder of the war. The report's conclusions were stark and unambiguous. The B-24 Liberator, and by extension the B-17 Flying Fortress with similar defensive armament, represented bomber designs where defensive capability had reached parity with fighter offensive capability. Traditional fighter tactics, developed against bombers with limited defensive fire, were obsolete and suicidal against American heavy bomber formations. The report recommended immediate tactical changes. First, abandon head-on attacks except in circumstances where fighter numerical superiority was overwhelming. The casualty rates among pilots making such attacks were unsustainable. Second, develop specialized heavily armed fighter variants capable of engaging bombers from outside defensive gun range. Existing fighter armament proved inadequate. Third, employ rocket weapons that could be launched from beyond 50 caliber range, destroying bombers without requiring close approach. Fourth, prioritize attacks on bombers that had left formation due to damage or mechanical failure. Isolated bombers lost the protection of mutual defensive fire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The report's most significant conclusion addressed the fundamental imbalance in the air war over Europe. American industrial capacity enabled the production of heavily defended bombers in quantities that overwhelmed German fighter resources. Each B-24 carried 10 50 caliber machine guns. Each gun required a trained gunner. Each bomber required approximately 60,000 man-hours to construct. America was producing these aircraft at rates exceeding 1 per hour at peak production. By mid-1943, Consolidated Aircraft Corporation's facilities at San Diego, California, and Fort Worth, Texas, plus Douglas Aircraft's facility at Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan, were collectively producing more than one B-24 every 100 minutes. The production statistics were almost incomprehensible to German planners. Total B-24 production would ultimately reach 18,482 aircraft, making it the most produced American military aircraft of World War II. This exceeded total German bomber production across all types for the entire war. The implications for the air war were profound and irrevocable. Germany could not shoot down American bombers as fast as America could replace them. Every experienced Luftwaffe pilot lost attacking bomber formations was irreplaceable. Every American bomber crew lost could be replaced within weeks by graduates from training programs producing thousands of aircrew monthly. The captured B-24 at Rechlin flew multiple test flights between August and November 1943. German pilots evaluated its handling characteristics, performance envelope, and flight dynamics. These flights revealed an aircraft optimized for specific mission profiles rather than general performance. Maximum speed at altitude was approximately 290 miles per hour, significantly slower than German fighters. Rate of climb was modest, approximately 1,000 feet per minute at full load. Maneuverability was poor by fighter standards, requiring wide turns and gentle control inputs. But these apparent weaknesses were irrelevant to the B-24's mission. It was not designed to dogfight. It was designed to fly in straight lines at high altitude, while carrying heavy bomb loads to distant targets. Speed, climb rate, and maneuverability were sacrificed for range, payload capacity, and defensive armament. The aircraft excelled at its intended role. Maximum range exceeded 2,000 miles with full bomb load. Service ceiling exceeded 28,000 feet, above the effective altitude of most German flak guns. Bomb load of up to 8,000 pounds could devastate industrial targets. German test pilot Major Robert Kowalski flew the captured B-24 6 times, accumulating nearly 15 hours at the controls. His assessment, included in Baumbach's report, provided a pilot's perspective on American design philosophy. The Americans have built a bomber that acknowledges the realities of modern air combat. They accept that bombers will be attacked. They accept that fighters will attempt interception. Rather than trying to outrun or outmaneuver fighters, they built an aircraft that can absorb punishment and return fire effectively. It is not elegant, it is not fast, but it is effective. And effectiveness, not elegance, wins wars. The contrast with German bomber development was striking and illuminating. German bombers of 1943, primarily the Heinkel He 111 and Junkers Ju 88, carried defensive armament that typically totaled 3 to 5 machine guns. These weapons were smaller caliber, typically 7.92 mm or 13 mm. Fields of fire were limited, particularly in forward and lower hemispheres. German bomber doctrine assumed fighter escort would protect bombers from enemy fighters. Defensive armament was secondary, almost an afterthought. This doctrine worked well when Germany maintained air superiority, as during the early war years over Poland, France, and initially over Russia. But when facing determined fighter opposition with numerical superiority, German bombers proved catastrophically vulnerable. Loss rates over Britain during the Battle of Britain in 1940 forced cessation of daylight bombing operations. Losses over Russia increased steadily as Soviet fighter strength recovered after 1941. By 1943, German bombers could operate effectively only where German fighters maintained local air superiority. American bomber doctrine reflected different assumptions and different strategic realities. American planners knew their bombers would operate deep inside enemy territory, beyond effective fighter escort range, for much of 1942 and 43. They knew bomber formations would face determined fighter attack. They accepted that bomber defensive firepower had to be sufficient to defeat fighter attacks without depending on escort protection. This led to the heavily armed bombers that shocked German analysis. The B-24's defensive armament represented approximately 15% of its empty weight. 10 guns, their turrets, ammunition, and fire control systems totaled approximately 5,500 pounds. This was weight not available for bombs, not available for fuel, not available for any other purpose. But American designers determined that reaching the target without being shot down was more important than carrying maximum bomb loads. Better to deliver 6,000 pounds of bombs to target than 8,000 pounds into empty air because the bomber was destroyed en route. The weight allocation reflected a broader American approach to weapons design. Systems were engineered to be effective in combat, not merely to meet theoretical specifications. If effectiveness required weight, weight was accepted. If effectiveness required complexity, complexity was accepted. If effectiveness required cost, cost was accepted. American industrial capacity made these trade-offs affordable. Germany, with more limited industrial resources and surrounded by enemies, could not make the same trade-offs as easily. German aircraft needed to be simpler, lighter, cheaper. They needed to be producible in quantity despite bomber attacks on German factories, despite raw material shortages, despite forced labor with limited skills. The result was aircraft that were often excellent in individual performance parameters, but lacking in the comprehensive capability that characterized American designs. The evaluation of the captured B-24 revealed this philosophical divide with stark clarity. American engineers had created a bomber that sacrificed speed and maneuverability for defensive capability and operational flexibility. German engineers had created bombers that sacrificed defensive capability for speed and economy. When these philosophies collided in the skies over Europe, the results vindicated the American approach. German bomber losses forced abandonment of daylight operations. American bombers continued operating despite losses because their defensive firepower made attacks costly enough to be sustainable. By late 1943, as the Rechlin evaluation concluded, the trajectory of the air war had become clear to German planners. American heavy bombers would continue attacking German targets in increasing numbers. Luftwaffe fighter strength would continue declining due to pilot attrition and production shortfalls. No tactical innovation could reverse these trends. The best German pilots, the Experten with dozens of kills, were being killed attacking bomber formations because even the best pilot could not evade defensive fire from 10 guns on a single bomber, multiplied by dozens of bombers in formation. The captured B-24 made one final flight in November 1943. Oberst Baumbach himself took the controls, flying the aircraft alone except for a flight engineer. They departed Rechlin and flew northwest toward the Baltic coast, climbing to 25,000 feet. Baumbach engaged the autopilot and walked back through the fuselage, examining each gun position from the defender's perspective. He sat in the ball turret, experiencing the cramped spherical compartment where American gunners spent hours watching for fighters attacking from below. The visibility was extraordinary. The turret rotated smoothly through full rotation, the guns tracking precisely. He understood immediately why German pilots hated the ball turret. There was no blind spot, no approach angle that avoided detection and fire. He climbed to the top turret, operating the controls that rotated the position through 360 degrees. Again, the coverage was complete. Fighters attacking from above entered the gunner's view at extreme range and remained visible throughout the attack run. The gunner had 10 to 15 seconds of tracking time before the fighter reached firing range, more than enough time to establish aim and begin firing. Baumbach returned to the cockpit and disengaged the autopilot. He flew the B-24 for another hour, experiencing its ponderous handling and stable flight characteristics. The aircraft felt solid, predictable, forgiving. It would not snap into spins or stalls. It was difficult to imagine an inexperienced pilot losing control even under combat stress. Everything about the design emphasized crew survival and mission completion. He landed at Rechlin as sunset turned the winter sky purple and gold. Ground crews secured the aircraft and covered it with tarps. Baumbach climbed down from the cockpit and stood on the tarmac, looking at the big American bomber one final time. In his report, he would write that this single aircraft represented everything that Germany was losing and America was winning: industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and most critically, a willingness to prioritize crew survival even at the cost of theoretical performance. The captured B-24 remained at Rechlin through the winter of 1943 and 44. It was occasionally flown for demonstration purposes, showing new fighter pilots what they would face over Germany's skies. It was used for gunnery training, allowing German gunners to practice against realistic American bomber turret configurations. Most significantly, it informed the development of German weapons specifically designed to counter American bomber defenses. The Werfer Granit 21, a 21-centimeter rocket, was developed specifically to allow German fighters to attack bomber formations from outside defensive gun range. The rocket had a range of approximately 1,200 yards, double the effective range of 50-caliber machine guns. Fighters could launch rockets into bomber formations without entering the kill zone of defensive fire. The rockets were unguided and inaccurate, but fired in salvos into tight formations, they achieved hits through statistical probability rather than precision. The Bordkanone 75, a 75mm cannon mounted on Junkers Ju-88 heavy fighters, represented another attempt to engage bombers from standoff range. The massive cannon could fire 20-pound projectiles capable of destroying a heavy bomber with a single hit. But the weapon's rate of fire was extremely low, approximately one round every 5 seconds, and mounting it required substantial aircraft modification that reduced performance. Only small numbers of these specialized aircraft were produced. More conventional armament improvements included increasing fighter cannon caliber from 20mm to 30mm. The Messerschmitt Bf-1 109 G6 variant, entering service in early 1944, mounted a 30mm Mk108 cannon in addition to machine guns. The heavier shells inflicted far more damage per hit than 20mm rounds. But they also required German pilots to close to lethal range, where American defensive fire was most effective. German tactical doctrine evolved continuously throughout 1944 in response to American bomber capabilities. The Sturmbok tactics employed heavily armed and armored Focke-Wulf 4 190 fighters that would press attacks to point-blank range, accepting defensive fire in order to guarantee bomber kills. These dedicated attack aircraft had additional armor protecting the pilot and critical systems, plus 4 30mm cannons providing devastating firepower. The concept was to create specialized bomber destroyers that could survive defensive fire long enough to destroy their targets. But even these heavily armed fighters suffered catastrophic casualties. The additional armor reduced maneuverability, making the Sturmbok fighters vulnerable to American escort fighters. The close-range attacks required to use their heavy weapons meant exposure to concentrated defensive fire from multiple bombers. Pilot losses in Sturmbok units exceeded 50% within months. The tactics inflicted serious losses on American bomber formations, but could not be sustained due to German pilot attrition. By mid-1944, American fighter escorts had evolved to the point where they could accompany bomber formations to targets anywhere in Germany. The North American P-51 Mustang, with range exceeding 1,500 miles when equipped with drop tanks, eliminated the escort gap that had made bomber formations vulnerable. German fighters now faced American fighters throughout their attacks on bomber formations. The dynamics shifted definitively in favor of the Americans. German fighters could not effectively attack bombers while under attack themselves from escort fighters. And if German fighters avoided engagement with escorts, bombers reached their targets unmolested. The air war entered its final phase. American bombers struck German industrial targets with increasing frequency and weight. Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, every major German city came under attack. German fighter production facilities were priority targets, creating a feedback loop where attacks on fighter factories reduced German ability to defend against future attacks. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Fuel shortages grounded remaining aircraft. Pilot replacements could not be trained adequately. American air superiority was absolute. The captured B-24 at Rechlin was destroyed in April 1945 during an American bombing raid on the test facility. Ironically, it was killed by aircraft of the same type. Allied forces overrunning Germany in the final weeks of the war found the wreckage and identified it through serial numbers. The intelligence value it had provided to Germany had been real but ultimately insufficient. Understanding American bomber capabilities did not provide Germany with the industrial capacity or strategic resources needed to counter them effectively. The B-24's combat record validated the design philosophy that German analysts had discovered during their evaluation. Total production of 18,482 aircraft made it the most produced American military aircraft of the war. These bombers flew thousands of missions against targets in Europe, North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific. They dropped approximately 635,000 tons of bombs. They destroyed industrial facilities, transportation networks, oil refineries, and military installations throughout Axis-controlled territory. But the cost was substantial. Approximately 3,700 B-24 seconds were lost in combat in the European theatre alone. Each loss meant 10 crewmen dead, missing, or captured. Total American bomber command casualties in Europe exceeded 79,000, with 26,000 killed in action. The losses reflected the brutal reality of daylight strategic bombing. Even heavily defended bombers could be shot down. Even with fighter escort, casualties were inevitable. The question was never whether losses would occur, but whether they could be sustained while achieving strategic objectives. American industrial capacity and personnel training pipelines meant the answer was yes. Losses, while tragic, were sustainable. Replacement aircraft arrived continuously. Replacement crews completed training and joined operational squadrons. The bombing campaign continued despite losses because the American system could generate combat power faster than Germany could destroy it. The Luftwaffe faced the opposite equation. Every experienced pilot lost was effectively irreplaceable by 1944. Training programs could not match the quality of pre-war and early war aviators. Fuel shortages meant new pilots received minimal flight time before being thrust into combat. The result was a death spiral where inexperienced pilots died quickly, never gaining the experience needed to survive, leading to even higher casualties among subsequent pilot cohorts. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The final accounting of the air war over Europe revealed the stark mathematics of attrition warfare between industrial powers. German fighters shot down thousands of American bombers, inflicting losses that would have crippled smaller nations. But America replaced those losses and continued operations without pause. The B-24 Liberator alone absorbed losses that exceeded 30% of total production, yet the bombing campaign never faltered. Oberst Werner Baumbach survived the war, surrendering to British forces in May 1945. In post-war interviews, he reflected on the captured B-24 and what it had revealed about American military philosophy. "We understood after examining that aircraft that we were fighting an enemy with fundamentally different assumptions about acceptable costs," he stated to Allied interrogators. "They built bombers expecting them to be shot at. They armed them, expecting close combat. They protected crews, expecting losses. We built aircraft to win individual engagements. They built systems to win campaigns. The difference was decisive." The contrast between German and American bomber design philosophy extended beyond defensive armament to encompass entire doctrinal frameworks. German bombers emphasized speed and payload efficiency, assuming fighter protection would handle enemy interceptors. American bombers emphasized defensive capability and crew survivability, assuming fighter escorts might be unavailable and that bombers must defend themselves. When tested in combat, the American approach proved sustainable, while the German approach proved catastrophic once air superiority was lost. The B-24's 10-gun defensive array represented more than just firepower. It represented a comprehensive approach to crew protection that valued human life as a strategic resource. Every gunner position had armor protection, however minimal. Every crew station had escape hatches. Fire suppression systems protected fuel tanks. Redundant systems ensured single failures rarely proved fatal. These features added weight and complexity that reduced theoretical performance, but they brought crews home alive. German bomber crews, flying aircraft with minimal defensive armament and limited protection, faced far higher casualty rates when operating without fighter cover. The Luftwaffe's abandonment of daylight bombing over Britain in 1940 reflected this vulnerability. German bombers simply could not survive sustained fighter attack. American bombers, while suffering heavy losses, could and did continue operations because their defensive capabilities made attacks costly enough to be tactically sustainable even when strategically devastating. The legacy of the captured B-24 extended into post-war aircraft design across multiple nations. Soviet bombers of the late 1940s and 1950s incorporated lessons learned from examining captured B-24 seconds and B-17 seconds. Heavy defensive armament became standard on strategic bombers worldwide. The Tupolev Tu-4, the Soviet Union's first strategic bomber, was a reverse-engineered copy of the B-29 Superfortress, which itself incorporated defensive fire control systems even more sophisticated than the B-24's manual turrets. The advent of jet fighters and guided missiles eventually rendered defensive gun armament obsolete on bombers. By the 1960s, speed and electronic countermeasures replaced defensive guns as primary survival mechanisms. But for the critical period of 1942 through 1945, when the outcome of World War II hung in balance, the heavily armed bomber concept proved itself decisively. American bombers brought industrial warfare to Germany's heartland, destroying the production capacity that sustained German military operations. The examination of tail number 4, 2-52886 at Rechlin in August 1943 provided German analysts with comprehensive technical intelligence. They understood American bomber capabilities in detail. They identified vulnerabilities and developed countermeasures. But understanding the problem did not provide solutions within Germany's constrained industrial and strategic circumstances. Knowing that American bombers were formidable did not grant Germany the resources to defeat them. The story of the captured B-24 ultimately illustrates the decisive role of industrial capacity in modern warfare. Technical excellence matters, tactical innovation matters, individual courage and skill matter. But when two industrial powers wage total war, the nation that can produce more weapons, train more personnel, and sustain higher losses while maintaining operations will prevail. The B-24's 10 defensive guns were not individually superior to German fighter armament, but there were 18,000 B-24 seconds, each with 10 guns, supported by the world's largest industrial economy. Germany could not match those numbers. The Luftwaffe's experienced pilots, flying sophisticated fighters and employing innovative tactics, achieved remarkable results in individual engagements. German aces recorded kill totals that exceeded Allied counterparts by multiples. But Germany lost the air war decisively because individual excellence could not compensate for systemic disadvantage. Every German pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every American aircraft lost was replaced within weeks. The captured Liberator at Rechlin revealed this fundamental imbalance to German analysts. The aircraft's comprehensive defensive capabilities demonstrated American willingness to accept weight and complexity to protect crews. The production serial number, 4-2-52886, indicated this was the 5,288th B-24 built. By the time German engineers completed their evaluation, that number had doubled. By war's end, it would triple. Major General Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, wrote in his post-war memoir that the arrival of American heavy bombers in strength over Germany marked the beginning of the end. "We could shoot them down in dozens," he wrote, "and they would return the next day in hundreds. We destroyed their aircraft and they built more. We killed their crews, and they trained more." The mathematics were inexorable. The B-24 Liberator, with its 10 50-caliber machine guns creating overlapping fields of fire, its armored crew positions, its redundant systems and damage tolerance, embodied the American approach to air warfare. Build capable systems, protect the people operating them, accept the weight and cost of comprehensive capability, then produce those systems in quantities that overwhelm opposition through sheer mass. It was not elegant. It was not efficient by German engineering standards, but it was devastatingly effective. Oberst Baumbach's final report on the captured B-24 concluded with an assessment that proved prophetic. This aircraft represents industrial warfare at its most comprehensive. It is designed not to win individual battles, but to win campaigns through sustained operations despite losses. Germany cannot match this approach. We lack the industrial capacity, the raw materials, the fuel, and the strategic depth. Understanding their system does not grant us ability to defeat it. The captured B-24 at Rechlin had revealed everything. German analysts understood American bomber capabilities completely. They knew the strengths, the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities. They developed tactics and weapons to exploit that knowledge. But knowledge alone could not reverse the fundamental imbalance in industrial power that would determine the war's outcome. The 10 guns of the B-24 Liberator created kill zones that Luftwaffe pilots learned to fear and respect. Those kill zones, multiplied across thousands of bombers, helped bring the war to Germany's skies and ultimately to its end.